Answer the false emperor!
Hi, welcome to part 3 of our Abaddon painting series. Today we're going to be focusing on the leather and the armour. So the first part of leather we're going to be doing is on his sword hilt. We're using 3 colours, which is AK Leather Brown, AK Saddle Brown, and then finally Citadel Cadian Fleshtone. So just base coat his sword hilt with the leather brown, and then we're just going to pick out some of the little details with the saddle brown, and then just some final highlights with the Cadian Fleshtone. Obviously if you're painting any other Black Legion models and you've got any leather, then just follow those. There's nothing too complex with that. No shading or anything needed with these 3 colours. They blend quite well together. Citadel do their various colours for the leathers. Rhinox hide, Steel Legion drab, sometimes good colours to be using for the leathers, but I just use their leather, AK Saddle Brown, and then Cadian Fleshtone as the final one. There's also a little bit of leather on his top knot, but again just follow those 3 colours and just follow the actual model really for placement of the highlights, and just pick out little points. And then we'll move over to the cloak, which uses the same colours but a slightly different technique. So for the cloak, we're going to be using AK Grim Brown as our base coat. So paint everything in AK Grim Brown, which is really like your Rhinox hide, very, very dark brown colour, reddish brown. And you saw there just before I started talking, the brush that I'm going to be using in the next stages. So this I'm just using a size O brush to do the base coat. The brush I'm going to be using after this is an old Citadel Drybrushes, which is a bit beaten up. It's got hairs sticking out all over the place. It's an old brush, but it's absolutely a fantastic brush to apply texture with. So we're going to be doing that with Abaddon's cloak. I wanted the cloak to be old, dark, and just heavily weathered. And the way we can be doing that is by watering down our paints and applying them in sort of stippled, dappling effect. But our first stage is to get a good base coat down, and for that, we're using AK Grim Brown. So just work over the leather cloak front and back, just applying the base coat. Once the base coat is applied, then put some of the AK Leather Brown on the wet palette and then heavily water it down. Usually 1 drop of paint to 5 drops of water, so it's almost like a wash, slightly thicker than a wash, but quite that consistency. Then load some up on the brush, and not too much, take some of it off, but then just literally, like you can see that I'm doing here, I'm stabbing the paint onto the model so that you get areas where there's not much paint and areas where there's a heavy deposit of paint. And I'm working this at first with this leather brown, which is our first sort of layer after the base. I'm pretty much putting this over about 80% of the cloak, leaving the grim brown in the deepest recesses. But just applying it in this fashion, you're naturally creating texture by thicker areas of paint, thinner areas of paint, and you get that both by the watered down and just where the pigment is heavier. So yeah, just work yourself around. Doesn't take that long. It will take a little bit of time to dry because there are some quite damp patches where you're leaving heavy deposits of paint. But as you can see, I'm leaving it the most paint in those raised areas. Okay, with the leather brown done, once it's dry, then we move on to the next colour. So we're using saddle brown. Again, water it down quite heavily, then apply some to your brush, take some off so it's not too heavy with the paint, and now we're just adding the highlights. So don't cover everything, just cover the raised edges, anything that stands out, cover those. And again, doing that stabbing, stippling process. I'm focusing quite heavily on the bottom, where it's mostly worn, so even in some of the recessed areas on the bottom I'm still applying some paint, just so that it shows that it's just worn everywhere, and just work yourself around. If there's any areas, once it's dry, feel free to add another couple of layers on top. In some of the more raised areas or the bottoms, I've done 2 coats or 3 coats once it's dry. Just remember to let it dry. It does take a little bit of time. Don't use the hairdryer method to try and dry it, because it's very wet, so you could end up smearing the paint if you use the hairdryer on too strong a setting. And don't be too scared that it looks like such a huge jump between colours. It does dry back a little bit darker, but that's why we're watering it down. So in some areas it's a subtle glaze, and in other areas it's quite heavily pigmented. And then our final step is to apply our highlight, which is with Cadian Fleshtone. Again, heavily watered down, many drops of water till you get the right consistency. Add some to your brush, and yeah, so I'm just going to be placing this. I had a little bit too much there. Just going to be placing this on the top highlights, on the bottoms of the cloak, anywhere where you want that most wear to be. This is the final highlight, and so you can add as much or as little of this as you want. On the very raised areas or on the bottoms, I did add a couple of extra layers on top just to make it look heavily worn, but you can add as much or as little as this as you want. And then once this is finished, the final stage, which is captured on the video, which is a little bit later on, the final stage of this is to edge highlight everything on the cloak with the Cadian Fleshtone, and the not watered down. You can use just a little bit watered down, just a little bit of water to it. Edge highlight everything, highlight any gaps and cuts and tears, highlight all of those, and then I also add just some little lines here and there just to show some weathering further up on the cloak, just to give it some extra texture. If you want, then once that's all dry, if you want to just add another layer on top of some Reichland Flesh Shade, feel free to do so. What that does is that dulls down the overall colour, but it does blend in all of the colours together, and you can even add some more of that into the recesses just to add some darker shadows into those recesses. I do 2 coats of Reichland Flesh Shade once everything's done. Then once that's done, just apply your edge highlights again with the Cadian Fleshtone just to bring back some of that intensity. And that's our leather cloak done for Abaddon, and you can use that technique on any large areas of leather that you're doing. On the AOS giants, they have a lot of leather on them, it's really good on that. You could also use this effect on other cloak colours like reds and greens. It works in the same process, so heavily watered down paint applied in that rough stippling fashion gives you some nice weathered effects. some of the armour. For that I'm using two colours, which is AK Anthracite and AK Grey Blue. Even though there's a lot of black armour showing, there's actually not too much to highlight. So all I do here with the Anthracite is I just pick out and edge highlight the armour and then do some spot highlights with the Grey Blue just to show there's some like reflections on the black armour. There's not too much to do really. Just go around your standard edge highlighting just to define the shapes around his hands, on the shoulder pads, on his legs. Just work yourself around the model and edge highlight as you normally would with Anthracite and Grey Blue. Then once we've finished with the armour, I'm just going to do the pipes. And for the pipes, we're actually going to do the first highlight with dark sea blue, and then I'm going to mix in a little bit of that grey blue with it, like a 50-50 mix, just to do some little spot highlights across the pipes. You could use the anthracite for your highlights on the pipes, or vice versa. You could use the deep sea blue, dark sea blue, sorry, for your armour highlighting, to save having to have that anthracite out. I just find the dark sea blue can be quite dark on the armour, hard to pick out. But for the pipes it's fine, it offers a little bit of variation. So yeah, that's dark sea blue, and then a 50-50 mix with the grey blue as a little spot highlight on the pipes. I also pick out the sort of mesh work on his Talons of Horus. I pick that out as well with the dark sea blue and grey blue 50-50 mix. With the armour done, we're now just going to move on to Abaddon's hair. I wanted just to make the hair stand out a little bit than just your standard black, so I went for a sort of deep purplish colour. So to achieve this, I base coated everything in AK Dragon Blood. I then do the initial highlight using the AK Violet Red, and with that I'm just going to be picking out the strands of hair anywhere that would catch the light, and then a final edge highlight of AK Magenta. Not too much, I don't want it to be too bright, I want it to be quite dark. You can just highlight it using those armour colours or the pipe colours, but I find that it blends in a bit too much, it doesn't really stand out, and I wanted his hair to stand out a little bit. So yeah, I chose sort of a purplish pink for Abaddon. And yeah, so that dragon blood, over large areas it can be quite hard to paint, it's quite a thin colour, but on that it was fine. And then all I'm going to do here with the violet red is just pick out the strands of hair towards the ends and the top part of its top knot, and then the magenta is just the final highlight over some smaller points. So once we've done the hair, the final stage for this part is just going to be highlighting and put some colour down on the fur that goes over his back part of the cloak, the top part of the cloak. And for that I'm just using two colours. I'm using AK Japanese Brown and the AK Light Earth, and I sort of wet dry brush with the Japanese Brown and then just do little spot highlights with the Light Earth. It's nothing too clever here. You can use any colours here, especially from the Citadel range will work well with this, like besticle browns. Try and keep them a different set of browns from your leather browns, otherwise it blends in a bit too much. Obviously you can do so if you want it to all look sort of similar. I just wanted just different colour browns just to pull it out. I was also nervous that Japanese brown is also a colour that you can use for non-metallic metal gold, and I didn't want the fur to look too golden, which is why I added some of the light earth and ivory colours afterwards. And with that, these next few stages are done, so I hope you've enjoyed following along with those tutorials. As always, like and subscribe and comment, they're really much appreciated, and happy painting!